Hello.
It was one of those late afternoons that carried a strange calm with them, the kind where the light seemed softer than usual, stretched thin across the rooftops, spilling golden reflections on windows that were already beginning to darken. I had decided to stop by my friend's house before heading home. In my backpack was a heavy history book that he had lent me earlier in the week, and I wanted to give it back before I forgot. It wasn't anything important, just a small errand, but I had convinced myself the walk down his street was familiar. I had been there countless times before, sometimes on weekends when we stayed up too late playing video games, sometimes after school when we spread books across the living room and pretended to study. His house always stood out to me, not because it was grand or unusual, but because it carried a sense of warmth. The lawn was neat, the curtains often half-drawn, the porch light always in working order. It was the kind of house that felt lived in, not just occupied. When I finally reached his door, I rang the bell with the expectation of hearing his heavy footsteps tumbling down the stairs, his quick voice calling, "Coming!" But instead the seconds passed in silence. Just as I was about to press the bell again, the door swung open and his mom appeared. She greeted me with a look of mild surprise, her brows lifting just slightly before she smiled. "Oh, hi. I wasn't expecting you. He's not home right now. Went out with a couple of friends, I think." I adjusted the strap of my backpack and pulled out the book. "Yeah, I just wanted to drop this off. I can leave it with you." She reached out, her fingers brushing mine lightly as she took the book, and for a moment her gaze lingered in a way that felt heavier than a casual exchange. She glanced behind her, into the dim hallway, then back at me. "You could wait if you like. He probably won't be too long." I hesitated, unsure. Waiting felt awkward, like intruding on a household without my friend to anchor me. "That's all right," I started to say. "I don't want to bother." Her smile deepened, a little softer now, as if she had expected that answer. "Actually," she said slowly, "why don't you stay for dinner? I made more than enough, and it would be a shame to let it go to waste." The invitation caught me completely off guard. My first instinct was to politely decline. After all, I had come only to drop something off, not to sit at the table. But there was something in her tone that held me there. It wasn't casual small talk. It was careful, deliberate, like she was asking more than she was saying. "Are you sure?" I asked, voice quieter than I meant. "Of course," she replied, the words leaving no room for argument. "It would be nice to have company." She stepped back, opening the door wider, and I found myself moving forward before I had fully decided. The hallway stretched ahead, familiar but strangely different without my friend's laughter filling it. I had walked that path countless times, sneakers squeaking on the tiles, usually with him by my side, but now each step echoed louder, sharper. The house smelled of food, garlic and herbs, rich tomato sauce simmering somewhere beyond sight, bread warming in the oven. The aroma carried through the hall and into me, and suddenly my hesitation felt heavier. Refusing would almost seem rude now, like rejecting not just a meal but an offering. She closed the door gently, the latch clicking into place. I slipped off my shoes and followed her toward the kitchen. Every corner of the house carried its own memory. The stairwell where we once slid down on cardboard, the living room where we sprawled on the rug with controllers in hand, the upstairs hall that echoed with our footsteps as we raided the fridge past midnight. But tonight all those memories seemed muted, replaced by the immediate awareness that it was just her and me. When we reached the kitchen, the atmosphere grew warmer, almost glowing. The overhead lamp shone onto a table that was already set, Two plates neatly placed across from one another, glasses catching the light. A pot simmered quietly on the stove, steam curling upward in delicate spirals, and beside it a basket of bread rested under a cloth. The air was thick with the scent of dinner, familiar but heightened, as though every smell had been sharpened into something vivid. She moved easily through the space, checking the stove, adjusting the cloth over the bread, reaching for utensils. I lingered near the doorway, unsure if I should sit or wait to be told. She noticed my uncertainty and gestured lightly to the chair across from her. "Go ahead. Make yourself comfortable." I sat down slowly, the chair creaking under me. From this angle, the kitchen felt at once ordinary and strange. A place I had seen countless times, but never like this. My friend wasn't here, the usual noise of his presence missing. Instead, there was only the quiet sound of simmering sauce, the faint hum of the refrigerator, and the awareness of her moving gracefully across the room. The table was simple, but the details caught my attention. A folded napkin beside each plate. A candle on the counter, unlit but placed deliberately. Silverware that gleamed under the lamplight. All ordinary things, and yet together they carried a kind of care, a thoughtfulness that pressed against me more than I expected. As she set the last dish down, she looked at me again, her expression unreadable for a moment before softening. "See? Not a bother at all. Just sit, relax. Dinner's better with someone to share it with." Her words hung in the air longer than they should have, weaving themselves into the quiet around us. I nodded, not trusting myself to answer right away. The moment had already shifted. What had begun as a simple errand was no longer simple. It had become something else, something harder to name, wrapped in the soft glow of a kitchen lamp and the unexpected invitation of a voice that seemed to carry more than its surface meaning. The first few minutes at the table were filled with the quiet rituals of dinner. She served the pasta with careful motions, spooning sauce onto the plates, steam rising and curling into the warm air of the kitchen. I thanked her awkwardly, not sure if my voice sounded too small, and she only smiled as she set the basket of bread between us. The scrape of silverware against porcelain was louder than it should have been, each sound magnified in the absence of conversation. At first she spoke about ordinary things, the weather, how quickly the week had passed, how she had gone to the market earlier in the day. I responded politely, grateful for the normalcy, but beneath it I felt the tension of something else waiting just beyond the surface. Her eyes lingered on me a fraction longer than they needed to, and every pause between sentences seemed heavier than the last. She asked about school. I told her about assignments piling up, about teachers who seemed impossible to satisfy. She listened intently, resting her chin lightly on her hand, as though my complaints carried more weight than they deserved. "You remind me of him at your age," she said softly, meaning her son, my friend. "Always rushing, always distracted, never realizing how fast these years go." The words should have felt casual, but there was a note in her voice. Not regret exactly, but something close. I broke off a piece of bread to distract myself, focusing on the texture of the crust beneath my fingers. She leaned back slightly, her gaze thoughtful. "You come over a lot," she added. "I noticed that, more than some of his other friends." I swallowed too quickly, nearly choking on the bread. "Yeah, I guess. We study together sometimes." "Study?" she repeated with a faint smile, as though the word carried a secret. The silence stretched again, filled only by the clink of forks. I found myself studying the details of the room to avoid her eyes. The faded calendar pinned to the wall, the way the candle on the counter remained unlit, the faint hum of the refrigerator. But even as I tried to focus on these small things, I could feel her attention on me, quiet but persistent. She shifted the conversation, asking about my family, my plans for the summer, what I wanted to do after school. They were safe questions, yet she asked them with such careful curiosity that it felt different, almost intimate. I answered as best I could, sometimes stumbling, sometimes rambling too long. She didn't interrupt, didn't fill the gaps with small talk. She let me speak, and in the spaces between, she let me hear my own uncertainty. "I used to feel the same way," she said at last, her voice gentler than before, like the world was both endless and impossibly small at the same time. "I thought I knew what I wanted, but looking back, maybe I didn't. Maybe I just went along with what seemed easiest." Her eyes had gone distant, her fork resting idle on the edge of the plate. For a moment she looked far away, caught in a memory she didn't intend to share. I watched her, unsure if I should respond, and when she finally met my gaze again, the moment had already passed. We finished eating slowly. Each time I thought the conversation had settled into ordinary ground, it veered slightly into something deeper, more personal. She asked what I valued most in people, what I feared about the future, whether I ever felt unseen even when surrounded by others. They weren't questions I had prepared for, and my answers came out halting, vulnerable. Through it all, the room seemed to grow smaller. The lamp above us cast a pool of light that enclosed the table like an island, and outside that circle the rest of the house faded into shadow. I became acutely aware of how alone we were, how the ticking clock on the wall was the only other sound keeping us company. And as the plates emptied and the silence between questions grew longer, I realized that dinner was no longer just dinner. It had become something else entirely. A conversation that lingered in ways words alone could not explain. A thread pulling tighter with every pause, every glance, every moment that neither of us moved to end. When the plates were nearly empty and the last of the bread had been torn into small pieces between us, the room seemed to quiet even further. The hum of the refrigerator grew louder, the ticking of the clock stretched into every pause, and I realized how little either of us had moved in the last few minutes. Dinner had ended in practice, but neither of us had stood up. The air seemed to hold us in place, unwilling to let the moment dissolve. She rested her elbows lightly on the table, fingers laced together, her eyes studying me with a focus that was at once disarming and impossible to ignore. I shifted in my chair, but it did little to break the intensity. I had known her for years, but never like this, never in the soft glow of a single lamp, never in silence that seemed to ask questions louder than words could. Her gaze flicked toward the counter where the unlit candle still stood. She reached out and picked up a matchbox, striking one with practiced ease. The sudden flame lit her features sharply for a heartbeat before she lowered it to the wick. The candle caught, its glow softer, warmer than the lamp above, and suddenly the kitchen felt different, smaller, more intimate. She smiled faintly, almost apologetic. "I thought it looked too plain without it," she said, though her tone carried something else. I nodded, not trusting my voice. The light shifted across the table, making shadows stretch and bend. My chest tightened with the awareness that this was no longer just about food. The ordinary rhythm of the evening had already blurred into something I could not define. She leaned back slightly, folding her arms, and let out a quiet breath. "You're quieter than usual," she observed. "I don't know what to say," I admitted. "Sometimes," she murmured. Not saying anything is the truest answer. The silence that followed was thick. I felt my heartbeat quicken, echoing in my ears. I became acutely aware of small details. The way the steam had faded from the plates, the faint scent of tomato and basil lingering in the air, the way the flame bent every time one of us shifted slightly. Each of these things pressed into me with a weight they didn't deserve, magnified by the unspoken question hanging between us. Her hand brushed the table lightly, fingertips tracing the grain of the wood, and though the gesture was small, it felt deliberate. I tried to look away, toward the darkened window, but the reflection of the candlelight there only drew me back to the space between us. She tilted her head, eyes steady on mine. For a long moment, neither of us moved. The roles we knew, mother of my friend, guest at her table, blurred at the edges until they no longer seemed fixed. All that remained was the charged stillness of two people suspended in a moment neither had planned, yet neither wanted to end. The candle flickered, casting her shadow across the wall, and the world outside the kitchen felt impossibly far away. I thought of the times I had eaten here before, with laughter and noise filling the air, my friend's voice bouncing through the room. This silence was different. It wasn't empty. It was full, stretched tight, ready to break if either of us dared to move. I gripped the edge of my chair, grounding myself, waiting for something. A word, a gesture, anything that might release us from the tension. But nothing came. She simply looked at me, and I at her until even time seemed to lose its shape. It was the kind of moment that cannot last. But while it held, it felt endless, a fragile space where everything ordinary slipped away and something unnamed lingered in its place. The moment broke not with words but with the scrape of her chair against the tile. She rose slowly, gathering plates, her expression unreadable again, softened back into the practiced calm of an ordinary evening. I followed suit, stacking silverware, anything to keep my hands busy. The rhythm of clearing the table, of rinsing dishes under the steady stream of water, filled the silence we could no longer carry. She thanked me quietly as I set the last plate on the rack. The candle still burned on the counter, its flame steady, as though it hadn't witnessed the tension at all. She blew it out with a gentle breath, and the kitchen dimmed instantly, leaving only the harsher glow of the overhead lamp. In that shift, the fragile space we had been caught in collapsed into something recognizable again. A mother tidying up, a guest preparing to leave. I slipped on my shoes in the hallway, the familiar creak of the floorboards beneath me echoing louder than I remembered. She walked me to the door, her steps slow, deliberate. When I turned back to thank her again, she smiled the same smile she had worn countless times before, but my chest tightened knowing it would never look quite the same to me again. "Come by any time," she said simply, her hand resting on the doorframe. The words were ordinary, but I felt the shadow of another meaning pressed beneath them. I nodded, unable to say more, and stepped into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the houses lit here and there, the sky stretched wide with the faint glow of distant stars. The world outside hadn't changed, but I had. As I walked away, the house receded behind me, shrinking into the landscape of familiar streets and well-kept lawns. And yet, in my mind, it loomed larger than ever, holding within it the weight of a dinner that was no longer just a dinner, a silence that spoke louder than any conversation could. The next day, when I saw my friend at school, everything looked the same. He laughed at jokes, shoved my shoulder in the hallway, talked about plans for the weekend. He asked casually if I'd dropped off the book, and I told him yes. I didn't mention dinner. I didn't mention the candle, or the way silence had filled the kitchen like a presence all its own. It became a secret lodged quietly in my memory, not dangerous but unshakable, something that would surface whenever I caught the scent of tomato and basil, or saw the warm glow of a single candle in a room otherwise dark. It wasn't something I could explain to anyone, not even to myself fully. It simply was, a moment suspended outside the flow of time, etched in the space between what was said and what was left unsaid. Life moved forward. Days blurred. Laughter returned. Plans unfolded. But beneath it all, that night remained untouched, a reminder that sometimes the smallest detours, a knock on a door, an unexpected dinner, can tilt the ground beneath you in ways that linger long after the moment has passed. And so I carried it with me, not as a burden, but as a quiet shift, a whisper of how fragile the lines between ordinary and extraordinary can be. A whisper that lived in silence, and in silence stayed.
Bye bye.